Well, I'll fill the 90 seconds with a little story. So, well, it actually ties into my introduction. But before the service, we meet back in Ed's room to pray, and Ed has a little space heater back there that for some reason decided not to work this morning of all mornings. And so Erin's back there, and she just can't let this thing go. She's like flipping it over, looking for switches, banging it, got it all sorts of... And I said, Erin, you realize we're going to be gone in 2 minutes. By the time you get this thing done, we'll be gone. And she's like, I just can't help myself. If something's not working, it drives me crazy, and I try to fix it. And I thought, well, can you come to my house? Because my attitude is if it's not working, I just leave it alone, and maybe if I come back later, it'll fix itself, right? So we're all different, so I might not have the kind of fix-it nature that Erin has, but I do love words. I love figuring out where words come from, and I like finding words that I don't know what they mean and trying to find out what they mean. And I don't know why I like that. Most of you probably don't, but we're sort of in one of those words right now in this season of our church calendar, and the word is Epiphany. Epiphany. We're in the season of Epiphany. You have the 12 days of Christmas, right? On the first day of Christmas, you know that? So there's actually 12 days of Christmas. And after the 12 days of Christmas, we enter into the season called Epiphany. And the word Epiphany comes from two Greek words, epi, meaning before, and phantom, kind of, which means like what you would think it means, like something that appears. Like we kind of came up with the word ghost, but so it really means when something appears before you. And it's when some revelation or insight that you get that you didn't have before. And so that's what the season of Epiphany is. It's getting an insight into the nature of Jesus. So at Christmas we celebrate that God became flesh. In Epiphany we try to get insight into why Jesus came. And there's actually traditionally 3 stories that are told during the season of Epiphany. The first one is the visit of the Magi. The second is the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist. And the third is the miracle that Jesus performs at the wedding of Cana. And so these are the rotating stories during Epiphany. And this week we are on the baptism of Jesus. That's what we're going to talk about this morning. And it's interesting because if you think about it this way, at least from a biblical standpoint, what we're doing this Sunday is more important than what we did Christmas Eve. Do you know that only 2 of the 4 gospel accounts even have any record or any stories about Jesus' birth? But all 4 gospel accounts talk about the baptism of Jesus. And so I think that there is some great insight, some great things that we can see when we look at the baptism of Jesus. But here's the thing about this Epiphany, right? Some epiphanies are cool, wow, I never saw that before, and I haven't, you hear that note, I had an epiphany, I saw something I never understood, and it was really exciting. And other epiphanies are the kind where we're forced to see things we'd rather not see. And I think as we look at the baptism of Jesus, it's probably more of that kind than the cool kind. And so I say that to open your hearts. And I think the best way we can open our hearts is pray. So will you pray with me? Lord, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the richness of your word and just the legacy of these great stories of you, Jesus. I pray right now for all of us. I pray that you would open our hearts. I pray that everybody in here would begin to think, why am I here? What message do you have for me, Jesus, in this story of your baptism? And I pray for your Spirit, Lord, to do what only it can do. We ask this in your name. Amen. So the story of Jesus' baptism is it's in all 4 Gospels, as I said, but we're going to look at Matthew 3, verses 13 to 17. And let me go ahead and read it, then I'll do a little explaining, and then we'll jump into the essence of what we're doing. So Matthew 3, verses 13 to 17 says this, "Then Jesus went from Galilee to the Jordan River to be baptized by John. But John tried to talk him out of it. 'I am the one who needs to be baptized by you,' he said, 'so why are you coming to me?' But Jesus said, 'It should be done, for we must carry out all that God requires.' So John agreed to baptize him. After his baptism, as Jesus came up out of the water, the heavens were opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and settling on him. And a voice from heaven said, 'This is my dearly loved Son, who brings me great joy.'" The first thing we need to look at and think about this morning is this nature of John's baptism. So Jesus comes out to the Jordan River to be baptized by John. Well, who was John? Well, John was Jesus' cousin, and John had what we would call a very prophetic ministry. He was a voice of God calling out to people. And in essence, John's message was simple. You need to prepare your heart for the coming of the Messiah. Prepare your heart for what God is doing. And in preparing your heart, John was pretty tough. I mean, he sort of said, like, in order to prepare your heart, you need to realize that you have a problem. And your problem is this thing called sin. The word sin, literally, like I said, I love words. The word sin is, the Greek word is hamartia. And it literally means to miss the mark. It was an archery term, and if you missed the bullseye, the judge would call out sin. And it meant that you missed the mark. You weren't measuring up to what you needed to measure up to. And John has this message. He says, look, if you really want to be prepared for the Messiah, you have to recognize that you've got this problem called sin. And until you deal with that, you won't be prepared. And he instituted this thing called baptism. Now, in the Jewish culture, they had baptism then. But baptism was not the way John practiced it. In most people that got baptized were people that decided to become Jews from another religion. And so they might have been like a Roman soldier or something, decided to become Jewish, and they would baptize him as an act of initiation into the Jewish faith. It didn't happen a lot, but that's typically how they baptized. But they would never baptize people that were Jews already, because they wouldn't see the point. You're already one. You were born one. Why would you get baptized? But John comes along, and John basically says that even if you're Jewish, you need to get baptized, because even if you're Jewish, you need to recognize that you have a problem. That being Jewish just isn't good enough. And apparently this kind of message struck a chord, because lots of people came out and were getting baptized, and John was really getting a lot of following, and Jesus shows up to be baptized. And when Jesus shows up, it creates a question that we're going to talk about. But John's question was basically, why are you doing this? Like, you don't need to do this, Jesus. But Jesus says, go ahead and do it, because it's what God requires. And in doing it, Jesus is trying to tell us something. And I think there are three things, if we look at them, we'll see what God is trying to say. And if we in this little story, if we look at John's challenge, Jesus' answer, and God's response. Okay? John's challenge, Jesus' answer, and God's response. So here's John's challenge in a nutshell. He basically looked at the culture that he was ministering in, and he said, you're not okay just because your culture tells you you're okay. In their day and age, what made them okay was if you were born a Jew. And that would make you okay because God had this unique relationship with the Jews. God had spoken to Abraham, God had spoken to Moses and King David, and if you were part of this lineage and part of this heritage, you were okay because these were the special people that God had spoken to. But John comes along and he says, look, don't just let what your culture says be enough. He says, at one point in the beginning of Matthew 3, not in the passage we read, he says this. He says, look, you think you're okay because you're a child of Abraham? He says, I tell you, God could raise up a child of Abraham from these very stones. He's like, look, don't hold on to what your culture is saying. If you really want to draw closer to God, you need to change. You need to change. Well, how does that translate to us? It's kind of easy to see in their culture, but how does that translate to us? And here's what I'd say. I would say for most of us, it is easy to think we're okay if our culture tells us we're okay. Most people, and here's a challenging way to think about it, most people, if you ask them, think they're going to heaven. Right? In fact, if you really want to anger most people, why don't you say, I'm not so sure you're going to heaven. I mean, I'm not saying I go around doing that, but I would say that in this culture, by and large, most people assume that heaven is their birthright, kind of. And that I'm a reasonably good person. In fact, I would bet even if you go to prisons, because I've gone to prisons, and even if you challenge them about, like, are you a decent person, and you tell them they're not, you'll tick them off. But most people operate under this assumption that as I look around my culture at large, I'm not the best person, but I'm certainly not the worst person, and I'm probably okay. And I probably don't really need to prepare much for my future, like John was preparing them for the future arrival of the Messiah. Most people operate on the assumption for my eternal future, I don't really need to be that concerned about it because it'll probably take care of itself because I'm okay. Well, let me ask you a question. Let's just assume that you're okay, or that I'm okay, and that your destiny is eternity. Think about this for a second. What if you spend eternity and you never change? What if the very person you are right now, that insecure, shallow, selfish, okay, the one that looks out mostly for you, maybe you look out for your family a little bit more, but beyond that, you're, okay, and look, you're a decent person. I'm a decent person. But what if that's me forever? Forever. And let me add another element to the equation. What if it's all of us, basically as we are, forever? Does that really sound like heaven? Do you really think that will work out? If there is not some kind of transformation, if there is not some kind of change, I'm not sure we're all okay. And that's what John was kind of saying. He's like, look, the things that you're holding on to that are telling you that you're okay might not be enough. And the epiphany this morning that I think this word challenges us is just that. Are you really okay? Is this really good enough? That's the challenge of John. Well, what about Jesus' answer? Because in steps Jesus, and here's the interesting part, the only one who didn't need a transformation, right? The only one who really was prepared for eternity, the only one who was with God, left to become human, and was going back to God, but the only one who didn't need to be transformed, steps forward and says, I will be baptized. I will be baptized with this recognition of, of sin and brokenness and this need for transformation. I'll do it. And John looks at him and says, you don't have to do this. Like everybody else has to do this, but you don't have to do it. But he says, do it. Do it. Why did he do it? Why would he step forward and do this? Well, there's lots of reasons, but here's probably the most significant, from my opinion right now, is that he was affirming John's challenge. When Jesus stepped forward and allowed himself to be baptized by John, he was making a statement that, hey, everybody, you know this challenge that John is giving to you? He's dead on. He's dead on. You need to be transformed. You need to be changed. Everything is not okay just because your culture is telling you it's okay. You know, the message of Jesus is both easy and hard. Here's the way I like to summarize Christianity. Ready? You get this one for free. A simple one-sentence summary of all the Christian faith right now. Ready? Here it is. Love is the answer. Unequivocally. Whenever you're trying to figure out what to do or what God thinks of you or what the right response is in a certain situation or how you should think about your relationship with God, love is always the answer. God is love, love is God, all that kind of stuff, but sin is the problem. Love may be the answer, but sin is the problem. The problem isn't lack of love, even though love is the answer. The problem is sin. And when Jesus steps forward to be baptized, Jesus in essence is stepping forward to say, sin is the problem, but here is the answer. And you know what the answer is? The great substitution. Jesus didn't need to be baptized because Jesus wasn't sinful. But Jesus, in this act of baptism, is in a sense, in this moment, taking on our sin. He is acting as if he's sinful as a substitute for us. And when he gets baptized, think about this. Imagine Jesus is walking up being baptized, and everybody that was walking forward to be baptized at this time was making an admission that, you know what, like I'm a broken person. I need transformation. And so everybody sees like, oh wow, that guy's going forward to be baptized. Oh wow, man, he must have some stuff going on. Oh, she's coming forward. Oh yeah, she probably needs it. Or, you know, all this kind of stuff, right? And here comes Jesus walking down and saying like, baptize me. Baptize me. And you know what people would think who didn't know him very well? He's got a problem. He must have something going on. And Jesus kind of took on sin. And that was sort of the precursor to the cross, right? That Jesus was going to substitute his righteousness for our sinfulness. Most people, honestly, I don't think of Jesus or themselves that way. I know my default is this. I'm basically okay, and I need Jesus' help for the big stuff like health and money, and I could use some pointers along the way. That's kind of how I tend to approach my faith in a default mode, right? You know, I'm basically all right. If somebody gets sick or money or some other problems, I might, hey, God, can you please help me? Jesus, thank you that you're so nice, right? And then occasionally I might go to Jesus for some advice about forgiveness or all that kind of stuff. But I don't live with this default that I've got a problem and Jesus is the answer. But when Jesus steps forward, that's what he says. What if that was our default? What if we lived with this greater awareness of our sinfulness and Jesus' sacrifice? What if our brokenness and his substitution were just kind of part of the air we breathe? Here's some things I thought about. What would it look like? What would it really look like to recognize how deep my need for transformation is. A couple things that just came to my mind. You could probably come up with a lot more. I'd probably be a lot more humble. I would probably be a lot more aware that if there's a problem in my life, I am most likely a contributor to it. Because I'm sinful. I'm broken. I probably would be a lot more authentic. I wouldn't try to hide or cover up the fact that everything's not working out. I wouldn't try to act like I'm better than I am. I'd probably be a lot less judgmental and defensive. Because, they're sinners, but so am I. Right? I probably would be a lot more open to the fact that a lot of what I think is wrong. Here's an interesting thought. When was the last time you said to yourself, hey, I was wrong? Remember the Fonz? Remember he couldn't say the word wrong, right? When was the last time you really thought something that you were just convinced of, something that you were committed to, you're actually wrong about it? Why wouldn't you be wrong? What would it look like at the same time if I recognized that I didn't have to pay the price for me being so broken? What if I looked at that, I recognized I'm not a good person. I'm not basically okay, but it's not up to me to make me okay. What if I lived with that awareness? And you know what? I would probably be a lot freer than I am. Because I put a lot of pressure on myself to be okay and to make sure everything's okay. My hunch is I would probably be full of a lot more gratitude and wonder in my life. And I'm just wondering, churchONE, if we could become more like that. I'm wondering if the questions we ask ourselves when as we think about what are better ways to do church, I'm wondering if we would think to ourselves, well, how can we be more authentic? How can we be more aware of our brokenness? How can we live as if love is the answer but sin is the problem? What would that look like? What would be practical ways that we would walk that out? My hunch is that's what Jesus would say. This is how you do it, man. This is how you do it. I know Thursday night a group of us got together. We gathered around the scriptures and we probably spent 45 minutes just talking about areas that were struggling. Things in our lives that made us sad. Things in our lives that were difficult that we didn't have answers to. And we just listened to each other. It was great. Nobody offered any solutions. We just listened, and then when we were done, we prayed. And then we opened the Word and kicked around a Bible passage for 15 minutes. Now, we all left with the same problems we came in with. We didn't become like magical saints or anything like that. But I feel like that was a little more of what Jesus would say. Yeah, that's why I did that. Yeah, you're getting it. Yeah, that's what it's supposed to look like. Because the end, what's interesting in all of this is God's response. God's response. So you have John with this challenge, Jesus stepping forward with this answer, and then God responds. And this is one of those, the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, that God is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This is actually one of those passages where all three players are involved, okay? Because here's what happens. After Jesus gets baptized, after he walks in this authenticity, after he presents himself as the solution, right? What happens? Two things happen. The Spirit descends on Jesus like a dove. And the voice of the Father says, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Now, what's interesting is if you look at this passage, I've read this passage a bunch, and I've often thought, man, if I was there and I saw the dove come down from heaven and this voice from heaven, I would be like, who is this guy, right? I would think it would get a big gathering. But the truth of the matter is that if you really look at it, there's a pronoun in there, and the pronoun is he, not they. That God only allowed, I think, John the Baptist and Jesus to see the Spirit and hear the voice. And here's what I think. I think when you open yourself up to God in this way, two things happen to you on a personal level. Two things that you should begin to experience more and more, and they are the dove and the voice. The dove is the presence of the Spirit. And what is a dove? A dove is a sign of what? Peace, right? As you authentically open yourself up to God, the Spirit of God, and I love to think about this, if we were writing this today, and this was like a cartoon or something, the Spirit would be like a lightning bolt, right? Pow! Power and all this stuff. Not a dove, just floating down, right? But what God is saying is that, look, as you begin to authentically open yourself up to me, what you experience is my peaceful presence. My peaceful presence. And then you hear my affirming voice. Because think about this. If Jesus is our substitute, then that means whatever God says to Jesus, He's saying to you. And He's saying to you right now, "You are my beloved child, in whom I am well pleased." And you say to me, "How can that be? I know who I am." And Jesus says, "That's why I got baptized. So that what God is saying to me, He can say to you." Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this epiphany, this incredible truth that we are your beloved children in whom you are well pleased. Not because what we have done, but because what Jesus has done. And I pray that the power of that message would begin to be transformative to us. Can you help us to become a more authentic community? Can you help us to become a community that recognizes its brokenness, but not just that rises above the brokenness in the love of a Father and the sacrifice of a Son and the presence of a Spirit? May that be true for us. I want to pray right now for each one of us. Just give us an opportunity right now to talk about an area where everything probably isn't okay. To think about a spot in our lives where things aren't as they ought to be. And ask you to help us to change. Help us be honest with you, but not fearful of you. Help us to see it clearly in the light of your love. Lord, may these things that we're thinking about right now, these areas of our lives where things are not okay, Lord, may we experience the beautiful, peaceful presence of your love in our hearts through your Spirit. And may your affirming voice speak to us.